Joining me in the homestand studio today is a Vancouver sports icon and kind of the voice of my childhood, Scott Rintoul, the man who just dropped a new podcast series titled Unreel, the West Coast Express, the story of probably the most slept on era in Vancouver Canucks hockey. Scott, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and joining me today.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for those very kind words, Justin. It's nice to be on with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, I'm going to dive right into it. What made the story of the West Coast Express so compelling for you to drop a series, entire podcast series on it?
Well, there's a lot of different things. I think the story itself, as you just alluded to, is such a great one. You know, if you just look at it on the surface, three players acquired by three different general managers, they all asked out of their original franchises where it didn't work out for one reason or another. And they wind up on the same line, which becomes the most dominant line in the NHL for a brief period of time. That alone is a great story. But then there's the part that you mentioned. It's a slept on time in Vancouver Canucks history. And maybe in terms of the NHL as well, it's the dead puck era. There's not a lot of pucks going in the back of the net. It's kind of boring hockey overall. And that's not to take away from any of the teams that flourished during that time, but it wasn't the most entertaining brand of hockey. And along came a team led by the line I just talked about that was entertaining, that did captivate fans and got them excited about offense in a time that really focused on defense.
Absolutely. Now, I was around that age group growing up in Vancouver where Markus Naslund, Todd Bertuzzi, Brenden Morrison, those were my guys. Like they made me fall in love with the game of hockey. But the era previous to that, with the Mike Keenan, Mark Messier era, you touch on that in the first two episodes of your podcast series. Now, the Canucks are not doing very well right now. So I'm going to ask you, you've been around Vancouver and the media market around there for years. What has been worse, the Canucks right now or that Messier-Keenan era?
It was the end of the 90s for sure. And the reason I'll tell you is this. The building was half full at those times. And that's not to point the finger at anyone in particular. Just the time frame you talk about, the late 90s for the Vancouver Canucks. Consider they had just opened a brand new arena a couple of years before. In 1997, they thought by signing the most high-profile free agent in their history and that was available on the market at the time, that it was the finishing piece that would put them over the top and win the Stanley Cup. They didn't even make the playoffs. 2 years later, barely anybody's coming to their games relative to having a brand new building and by the capacity. And the team is at the bottom of the Western Conference standings. Now, as poor as things have been for the Vancouver Canucks lately, that arena is pretty much full still. There's not apathy setting in among the fan base as of yet. There's emotion. There's people who are frustrated, but there's not apathy. And that is a far different kettle of fish. So to me, the end of the 90s were a more difficult time for the franchise and for the Vancouver Canucks than you're seeing right now.
Exactly. Now, you have a whole bunch of guests, a whole bunch of big name guests. I'm not going to spoil. I want everybody to listen to it. I'm not going to spoil who was on, who you got, excuse me. But as you went through this process, did you learn anything that was kind of surprising to you or kind of shocking to you about that era of the Canucks franchise?
Yeah, I've learned a lot along the way. And I thought I knew the story fairly well. I broke into media just as the West Coast Express was starting to come to prominence. So I covered that team to a certain extent, and I was pretty aware of what was going on with the franchise. But going back and learning about how the Canucks, I'll spoil it if you want to call it spoiling. It's more teasing to me. How the Canucks tried to sign Wayne Gretzky and almost got it done.
Yeah.
Hearing the great one tell that story. Yeah, I learned a few things along those lines. I learned about how dysfunctional players in the organization around that 97, 98 era felt it was, and the number of players who were uneasy about that and didn't feel comfortable about their jobs. And as I've gone through and constructed the story around the West Coast Express, I've learned a lot about Markus Naslund, Brenden Morrison, and Todd Bertuzzi, the relationship between the three of them, the way they pushed each other and tried to motivate each other that I certainly didn't know before.
Now, you kind of segue to my next question perfectly. What made the West Coast Express so special? Now, of course, Markus Naslund was the preeminent forward in the NHL. Todd Bertuzzi was the most dominant power forward in the league. But what actually made that trio so great?
Well, you mentioned Naslund and Bertuzzi, who were great players in their own right before Brenden Morrison joined that line. Andrew Castles, another underrated center from that time in the National Hockey League, was kind of the center that put those two together and formed some nice chemistry. but they really reached that next level when Brenden Morrison joined the line. I'm not going to say he's the most important member of the line, but he's kind of that Jerry Maguire piece of you complete me. That's what he did for that line, Justin, because when he got onto it, he gave them an element of speed and defensive responsibility that the line didn't have anymore. Markus Naslund and Todd Bertuzzi, they weren't going to come back all the way deep into their own end to retrieve the puck.
No chance.
Brenden Morrison was willing to do that. And because of his wheels, he was also unable to unlock their rush game. That was something that before they'd operated in more, if I want to use a basketball term, a half-court offense. And that's where all of their scoring came from, and the power play. But Morrison gave them the ability to score off the rush and that defensive ability as well. And that's really what made the line go from an excellent line to arguably the best line in the National Hockey League.
Absolutely. I remember Brenden Morrison saying, one of the clips, I think when they had brought all the guys back, saying that every night they expect to dominate, and they did for, like you mentioned, in the dead puck era. Now, again, they didn't have the playoff success that other Canucks teams in the past have had. Can that be counted back to what if, and I'll ask you this question straight up, if the Todd Bertuzzi, Steve Moore incident never happened, does that team fulfill their ultimate goal of winning a Stanley Cup? Because in 2003, they choked to Minnesota. They lost to a Detroit team the year before. That 2003-04 team was a very, very good team. And I think that was the pinnacle of their powers. Had that incident never happened, do you think they finally get over that hump?
There's a lot of what ifs because injuries can derail a team in the playoffs. And as you just mentioned, luck can derail a team in the playoffs. They looked like they were going to upset the Red Wings in 2002 until that turning point goal from Nick Lidstrom really changed the series. And Steve Yzerman dominated after that. They were up 3-1 on the Minnesota Wild, and everyone thought they had that series in the bag with Anaheim waiting, a team they played very well against that year in 2003. It looked like the Canucks might be playoff and cup bound that time, and were unable to get over. So it's easy to say, yeah, 2003, 2004, they would have won the Stanley Cup, or it would have been a great chance at winning a Stanley Cup. And I'll tell you this with a little bit of a tease, there are some people who believe that was the best version of that group, 03-04. Even though Markus Naslund and Todd Bertuzzi weren't challenging for the scoring title in the way they were the year previous, they felt they were a more complete team, a team that had learned its lesson after those playoff defeats that we just referenced. So, Justin, I can tell you there are some very high-profile people around the game of hockey who feel that was their best shot, but ultimately we'll never know because of the incident you mentioned.
Yes, exactly. Now, Henrik and Daniel Sedin are a part of this project. I want to ask you this question because this is something that I believe. I believe that Markus Naslund has a big part in Henrik and Daniel Sedin's growth to becoming the players that they became. I also think that Markus Naslund gets slept on a lot by Canucks fans when it comes to overall greatness. What are your thoughts on Markus Naslund? How do you remember him as a Vancouver Canuck?
I remember Markus Naslund as a classy, eloquent, well-spoken, respectful player who was exceptional. And I think you make an excellent point about the fact he is underrated when people go back. I'll give you a stat that maybe a lot of people don't know out there. From 01-02 to 03-04, so a span of 3 years in the National Hockey League, no player, no one scored more points than Markus Naslund. And it wasn't even close. He scored more than the next closest person by 36 points over that 3-year span. And the next closest was Todd Bertuzzi and Joe Thornton. They were tied behind him in second. So that's how good Markus Naslund was at that time. 3 consecutive 40-plus goal seasons as well. But your point about the way he mentored Daniel and Henrik Sedin is an excellent one. And it's something I asked them about during the course of this podcast. But I also don't want to sleep on the other 2 members of that line. Both Daniel and Henrik are complimentary of the way Todd Bertuzzi stuck up for them, not just on the ice, but off the ice during their time. Henrik Sedin learned a lot from Brenden Morrison. And perhaps one of the interesting things that we might not think about when it came to influencing the Sedins is that the Sedins took notes on how creative the West Coast Express was with having to come up with new ways to score. When teams would get a book on a particular play or a way that they were executing, well, they had to invent something different. And if you think of one of the hallmarks of Daniel and Henrik's career, It's creativity. They were always inventing something new. Just when you thought, well, they're not fast enough or they don't do this particularly well, they'd come up with a new play, that one off the end boards or some of the cycle plays that they created back in the day. Well, a part of that genesis is from the West Coast Express. So, Justin, I think your point is extremely well made. And I can tell you the Sedins agree with you.
I have to ask you about the current state of the Vancouver Canucks. Of course, Captain Bo Horvat was just traded at the beginning of this week. What do you think is next for Jim Rutherford, Patrick Allvin, and now Rick Tocchet? And where do you think this organization is going? Because I see a whole lot of parallels from the late 90s Canucks to these Canucks. Like you said, there's been a whole bunch of disjointedness. Where do you see the Canucks going forward?
Well, they seem to have declared at least a part of what their core is going to be moving forward. Rick Tocchet and management has been pretty open about the fact that Elias Pettersson, Quinn Hughes, and perhaps based on the contract, although it's not a terribly long one, Andrei Kuzmenko fits into that. JT Miller, by virtue of his contract, looks like he's going to be a part of that core for quite some time to come. And yeah, there are parallels to the late 90s. The Canucks, it's a different time. There was no salary cap back in those days. And while the Vancouver Canucks weren't a free spending team the way that the Rangers or the Red Wings were at the early part of this century, they didn't have to worry about bad contracts as much because you could spend your way out of them in the old NHL. You can't do that anymore. Mm-hmm. So they've been very open about the fact they need to get themselves some more cap flexibility. There are certain ways they could do that. I'm not sure exactly what tools they're going to employ, but I would expect far more surgery over the course of this summer and a doubling down on those players I mentioned, that core that they've identified with. What heights can Elias Pettersson and Quinn Hughes ascend to? And can Rutherford, Allvin, and the rest of the front office put the proper pieces around them to get this franchise back to a place where it's competing the way the West Coast Express did and ultimately those Sedin-led teams?
We can't end on a sour note like that, talking about the current state of the Canucks. We got to end on something positive. And I'm a big hypotheticals guy. So I'm going to pit the West Coast Express Canucks against the other two most prominent Canucks teams. And I want to hear your take on this. So the Canucks, the 94 Canucks, versus those West Coast Express teams. Who wins in a 7-game series? And the West Coast Express Canucks versus the 2011 Canucks. Who wins in a 7-game series?
It's hard for me to pick the West Coast Express out of any of them because ultimately they didn't get the goaltending that those other two versions got. Kirk McLean was sensational in 1994, and Roberto Luongo was one of the best goalies of his era and backstopped the Vancouver Canucks to a Stanley Cup final, nearly getting the job done with 2 shutouts in the final. So I can't say that the West Coast Express teams would have beaten them. Do I think Dan Cloutier takes too much of the blame for the West Coast Express's failures in the playoffs? I absolutely do. And maybe you'll hear some people, hint, hint, talk about that throughout the course of this series, why they felt ultimately they didn't get the goaltending they needed. But I would love to, for the promotion of this podcast, tell you that that team is better than the ones you mentioned, Justin. But I don't think it's the case because those teams, they weren't just hypothetical. They went there.
This might be a hot take. I think that 03-04 or that 02-03 team beats the 94 Canucks in a 7-game series because they had 2 of the best players on planet Earth at that time. But that might just be my recency bias, and that's the team that I grew up loving the most. So I don't know. Now, Scott, before we say goodbye, can you just let everybody know where they can listen to Unreel?
Absolutely. A lot of people listening or watching are probably very familiar with podcasts. So Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon, those are some of your biggest places to get your podcast. You can get them there. It's free. Follow it, subscribe to it. That way you don't miss any of the episodes that are coming up. The other place, if you're brand new to podcasting and you just want to learn a little bit more about a feed you might want to get, go to the website, unreelsports.com. That's Unreel with 2 E's, unreelsports.com. And from there, you can see all the episodes and actually listen to them off for that site, or you can set yourself up a feed so you don't miss any episodes along the way. The next one, as you mentioned, Justin, the first 2 are out right now. The next one is coming your way Friday, February 10th.
Perfect. I cannot wait. Scott, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and joining me. And thank you for bringing back some positive vibes with the Canucks and allowing me to reminisce, about my childhood.
Well, I had you in mind when I created this series, Justin, so I'm glad you're enjoying it.
I appreciate it. Take care, Scott.
You as well.